A woman stands in light so bright it hurts to imagine. Jeweled robes, gold chains at her wrists, gold chains at her neck, so heavy that 2 Roman guards walk beside her, bearing the weight. She does not cry, she does not beg. Around her, thousands of voices, a language she understands, a language she refuses to speak. She has been walking for 3 hours. She will walk for 4 more. The procession stretches ahead, caged lions from Africa, chained soldiers still bleeding from battle, painted replicas of cities burning, all of it moving slowly through streets lined with Romans, who came to see exactly this behind her. Silence. The space reserved for those who won't see sunset. Look at her again, the jewels catching Mediterranean sun, the robes still royal, the chains still gold. Why is she wearing jewels to her execution? Why aren't they killing her? This is the moment history remembers. Captured queen, Roman triumph, public humiliation. But what you think happened here didn't happen at all. Or worse, it did, but for reasons no one wants to admit. To understand what Rome did to queens, you have to first understand what queens weren't allowed to be. If documented history still matters to you, stay close, because what's coming isn't what you've been taught. Her feet are bleeding. She doesn't look down. 272 CE, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra, while Rome tore itself apart in civil war, she carved out an empire, Egypt to Anatolia. Legions couldn't stop her because legions were busy killing each other for the throne, but civil wars end. When Emperor Aurelian finally turned east, her forces crumbled. She fled toward Persia with what remained of her army. They caught her at the Euphrates River. She didn't resist. There was nowhere left to run. Captured enemies were paraded through Rome in triumphs, public celebrations of victory. Defeated kings displayed in chains, then executed in the Toulon prison, the stone chamber built into the Capitoline Hill where Rome's most dangerous enemies were strangled or starved. This had been tradition for 5 centuries. Zenobia would walk through Rome in golden chains. Then she would die. That's the story, except that the Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies written 40 years after her capture, claims she was adorned with jewels that caught sunlight. Why waste expensive display on someone about to die? Every ancient account mentions one specific detail. She maintained remarkable composure throughout the ordeal. Why does every witness emphasize her dignity? What were they watching for? Aurelian captured Zenobia in 272 CE. He didn't parade her through Rome until 274 CE, 2 years. Standard practice was immediate display. Vercingetorix walked in Caesar's triumph within months of his capture. Jugurtha was paraded the same year he surrendered. What took 2 years? Most accounts end here. They tell you she walked through Rome in chains. They tell you crowds jeered. They call it humiliation. They don't tell you what humiliation actually meant or why it required 2 years of preparation. Most people stop listening here. That's why history keeps lying. Subscribe to Crimson Historians if you haven't already. Now, brace yourself for the brutal truth that comes next. The golden chains weren't symbolic, they were functional. Here's what we know about Roman law regarding war captives. The principle was called ius gentium, the law of nations. It stated simply, military defeat transforms free people into property. Once a city fell, once an army surrendered, its inhabitants became legally enslaved. Regardless of former status, regardless of gender, a defeated queen had no more legal standing than a defeated soldier. Actually, she had less. Roman law protected citizens from certain punishments. To flog a Roman citizen was scandalous. To execute one without trial sparked outrage, but foreign captives held no such protections. They could be displayed, sold, killed at the discretion of their captives. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code from the 5th century BCE, made this explicit. Prisoners taken in war became property of the Roman state. So if captive queens were property slaves by legal definition, why did Rome treat them differently than other slaves? After Cleopatra's death, her daughter, Cleopatra Selene, was taken to Rome as a child. She wasn't executed, she wasn't enslaved in the traditional sense, She was married to a client's king, sent to rule Mauritania. Why would Rome legitimize the bloodline of an enemy they just annihilated? Why give royal authority back to someone whose mother had tried to destroy the Republic? 60 CE Britain. When King Prasutagus of the Iceni died, he left a will splitting his territory between his daughters and Emperor Nero. A compromise meant to preserve independence while satisfying Rome. Roman officials ignored it, seized everything, declared the kingdom forfeit. Queen Boudica protested. They flogged her publicly in front of her people. Her daughters, likely teenagers, certainly unmarried, were violated by Roman soldiers, also publicly, also in front of their people. Tacitus records this with what he calls unusual directness for such matters. He emphasizes that even Romans found it disturbing. The problem is this: Roman law allowed it. Roman military culture normalized it. Captured women were considered spoils of war. This wasn't controversial. So why did Tacitus feel compelled to note that even Romans were shocked? What line had been crossed? The Romans weren't mindless brutes. They built legal systems that survived millennia. They wrote philosophy about virtue, justice, honor. They understood dignity. So when they stripped a queen naked and flogged her while her people watched, they knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't punishing her. They were answering a question. The triumphs, the public displays, the careful choreography of captured royalty walking through Roman streets in chains. They weren't about showing conquered enemies. They were about proving something Rome needed conquered people to believe, to understand what you need to see what came before the triumphs, what happened in the months, sometimes years, between capture and parade. Captive queens underwent a process Roman records barely mention. Between capture and triumph, they weren't held in prisons. They were held in preparation. The Historia Augusta mentions Zenobia was so debilitated by captivity that guards had to support her during the procession, not from torture. The jewels and robes were intact. Her body showed no marks from deliberate physical weakening. Controlled starvation. Just enough food to survive, not enough to maintain strength. The amount was calculated. Roman military doctors understood nutrition. They knew exactly how much grain, how much water, how much protein kept a body alive while ensuring progressive muscle loss. The rations were delivered on irregular schedules, sometimes twice a day, sometimes once every 2 days. The unpredictability prevented the body from adjusting to a routine. Sleep deprivation through constant noise and irregular schedules. Guards changed watch with maximum disruption. Doors slammed at random intervals. Conversations held deliberately near her cell at odd hours. Torches replaced at midnight when darkness would have finally allowed rest. The cell was never completely dark, never completely quiet, never completely predictable. Isolation alternating with forced interaction. Days of complete silence where no one spoke to her, no one acknowledged her presence. She was fed through a slot in the door like an animal, left alone with nothing but her thoughts and the growing weakness in her limbs. Then sudden interrogations, questions about Palmyra's treasury, about her generals, about her son's whereabouts. Questions she'd already answered. Questions that had no purpose except to force her to speak, to engage, to remember she was still human enough to be questioned. Then silence again. Not enough to damage the body visibly, just enough to ensure she couldn't stand without assistance. Just enough that when the day came for her to walk through Rome, she would need Roman hands to hold her upright. The symbolism was intentional. She would walk in her own power, or rather she would try to walk in her own power and fail, and Rome would be there to catch her. But there was something else in the preparation process that sources mention only in passing. Captive royalty were required to watch what other prisoners being executed. Gladiatorial games, public punishments in the arena. Cassius Dio mentions this detail when describing the captives from Decebalus's Dene Wars. They were brought to Rome months before Trajan's triumph. During that time they were regularly taken to the Colosseum, not to fight, to observe. They watched criminals thrown to animals. They watched gladiators kill each other. They watched prisoners of war from earlier campaigns executed in elaborate staged battles. Reenactments of Rome's victories performed by men about to die. They sat in special sections, guarded, visible to the crowd. The audience could see them watching, could see their reactions. Why? To ensure they understood what mercy looked like. When Zenobia walked through Rome in golden chains, weak enough to need support, she'd already spent months watching what happened to captives Rome didn't consider valuable enough to preserve. He'd seen men torn apart by dogs. She'd seen gladiators bleed out in the sand while crowds cheered. She'd seen prisoners of war, men who'd once been soldiers, who'd once fought for their kingdoms, reduced to entertainment. She'd seen what execution looked like. She knew what she'd been spared, and everyone watching her knew she knew. Before triumphs, captive royalty were bathed, dressed in their own royal regalia, given their jewelry back. The preparation for this was elaborate. Ancient sources mention that Zenobia's robes were repaired where campaign dirt had damaged them. Her jewels were cleaned. Professional jewelers brought in to restore their shine. Her hair was arranged in the Palmyrene royal style. Every detail mattered. Every element of her appearance had to be perfect. Not mercy, contrast. The message wasn't, look at our captive. It was, look at what power looks like when it can't protect you. Think about what the crowd saw. A woman dressed in silks that cost more than most Romans earned in a year, wearing jewelry that represented the wealth of an entire kingdom. Every visible element screaming royalty, power, status. Except she couldn't walk on her own. A queen who once commanded armies, who signed treaties with Persia, who administered justice over millions, who executed enemies and pardoned allies, who'd minted coins with her own face beside the emperor's, claiming equality with Rome itself, now walking in chains while Roman guards hold her upright because she's too weak to stand alone. Her robes are royal, her jewels are real, her hair is perfect, but she needs help to walk. That contrast was everything. That was the entire purpose of the 2 years of preparation. To create a woman who looked like power incarnate but moved like a broken thing. Roman triumphs were psychological warfare, but not against the defeated queen. They were messages to her play, to allied kingdoms watching from the crowd, to future rebels, considering resistance. The subtext was always, if divine right could have saved her, it would have. If military strength could have saved her, it would have. If political authority could have saved her, it would have. None of it did. But that doesn't explain why some queens were spared. Zenobia lived. Most captive kings died immediately after their triumphs. Bursting the Gic chieftain who unified the tribes against Caesar executed within hours. Jugurtha, king of Numidia, starved to death in the Tulanum over 6 days while Rome celebrated above. Simon Barora, leader of the Jewish revolt, strangled in the Forum while Titus's triumph continued to the Temple of Jupiter. Zenobia was given a villa outside Rome. Ancient sources claim her daughters married Roman senators. Why? The answer isn't in what Rome did to its enemies. It's in what Rome needed from its allies. By the 3rd century CE, Rome controlled territory from Britain to Mesopotamia. They couldn't garrison every province, couldn't watch every border, couldn't station legions in every city that might rebel. The math didn't work. Rome had roughly 30 legions, about 150,000 legionaries. That's 1 soldier for every 300 people in the empire. Not enough to occupy, only enough to punish. So Rome ruled through client kings, local rulers who maintained their thrones by accepting Roman oversight. This system required one thing above all: credibility. Client kings had to believe their cooperation would be rewarded, but they also had to believe that challenging Rome meant total destruction. They ruled through fear, but not fear of conquest, fear of worthlessness, fear that everything you've built will mean nothing, that your bloodline will be absorbed, that your kingdom will forget you, that your own children will become Roman. When Rome captured a queen, they aced a choice. Execute her fast, clean. She becomes a martyr. Her people remember her as a hero who died resisting. Resistance becomes noble. Sacrifice becomes honorable. Another generation grows up hearing stories about the queen who chose death over submission. Stories are dangerous. Stories inspire. Rome had learned this with Spartacus, whose execution inspired 3 more slave revolts in the following century. Let her live, keep her visible, let her age, let her become ordinary, let her people see their once mighty queen living as a Roman dependent, her daughters married to Roman men, her grandchildren speaking Latin, her bloodline absorbed into the empire that destroyed her. Let them watch power dissolve into irrelevance. Execution creates legends, survival creates questions. Zenobia spent her final 30 years in that villa outside Rome. Ancient sources don't record what she did there, whether she wrote, whether she received visitors, whether she maintained correspondence with Palmyra, whether her daughters visited. We don't know if she asked them to. Think about what survival meant. Every day waking up in a Roman villa, eating Roman food, speaking Latin because no one around you speaks Palmyrene anymore. Watching your daughters marry men whose fathers conquered your empire. Watching your grandchildren grow up Roman, not tortured, not imprisoned, not executed, just irrelevant. Execution ends the story. The queen becomes legend. Her people can say she died rather than submit. She chose honor over survival. She resisted to the end. But survival makes people ask, was resistance worth it? And if the answer even might be no, why would anyone resist again? Now go back to Boudica, her flogging, her daughter's violation in public in front of the Aini people. Rome didn't do that to break her. They did it to provoke her. They wanted the rebellion because they'd learned that gradual subjugation created ongoing resistance. But when Rome provoked immediate total rebellion and crushed it completely, the conquered territory stayed quiet. Boudica's rebellion ended with 80,000 Britons dead in a single afternoon at an unknown battlefield. Her army, vastly larger than the Roman forces, was annihilated through discipline and positioning. Tacitus claims she poisoned herself rather than face capture. Her defeat was so total, so bloody, that Britain stayed quiet for 3 generations. A living Boudica would have been dangerous, a symbol of resistance, a rallying point for future rebellions. A dead Boudica crushed after a failed revolt that cost 80,000 lives became a warning. The Romans understood something that we pretend to have forgotten. The cruelest thing you can do to a queen isn't kill her. It's let her live long enough to watch everything she built mean nothing. If stories like this disappear, we don't evolve, we repeat. Crimson Historians exists because someone needs to remember. Subscribe if that matters to you. But the story doesn't end with their deaths. It ends with what Rome did after. 3 generations later, Roman historian Cassius Dio writes about British queens with a tone that borders on anxiety. He describes Queen Cartarendua of the Brigantes, a Roman ally who turned over the fugitive Caradicus and maintained peace for decades with language that emphasizes her political marriages, her diplomatic skills, her ability to negotiate. He never mentions military capability. He never suggests she ruled through strength. Why? Because Rome had successfully redefined what queenship could mean in Britain. Not warriors, diplomats, mediators, marriage brokers, never threats. After Zenobia, no Eastern queen challenged Rome for 2 centuries. When Palmyra rebuilt, it never crowned another woman, the city-state that had been ruled by queens. Since the 1st century CE suddenly stopped, not because of law, because of memory. After Boudica, Celtic tribes in Britain stopped putting women in military command. The archaeological record shows it clearly. Warrior burials that had included women for centuries suddenly stopped including them after 60 CE. This wasn't coincidence. This was learned behavior. Rome fell in 476 CE. The empire that perfected breaking queens without killing them collapsed from within, weakened by succession crises, civil wars, unstable leadership, and one of the recurring problems, Rome never successfully established female succession. Imperial wives and mothers wielded enormous shadow power, but that very ambiguity created instability. Agrena, Livia, Julia, Donna, powerful women operating through sons and husbands because they could never rule directly. The same system that broke foreign queens prevented Rome from stabilizing its own royal women. The irony is almost funny. Almost. Zenobia's villa still exists. It's a ruin outside Rome now, barely marked, rarely visited. No tours, no plaques. The Mamertine prison where male captive kings were executed is a tourist attraction, preserved, documented. You can stand in the cell where Vercingetorix died. You can see where Jugurtha starved. Guided tours run every hour. But there's no monument to what happened to queens. No marker for Boudica's daughters whose names we don't even know. No memorial for the women who survived triumphs and spent decades living in Roman villas, watching their empires forget them. History remembers the executions. It forgets the survival, because survival wasn't mercy. It was the punishment that lasted longer. We still do this not with chains, not with triumphs, but we still measure power by who breaks publicly and who doesn't. We still watch powerful women fall and ask, did she stay dignified? Did she cry? Did she beg? Did she maintain composure? We've upgraded the technology of humiliation. We haven't upgraded the impulse. History asks, what happened to captured queens? The better question is, what did Rome need captured queens to become in order for the empire to function, and have we stopped needing that? A 6th century Syrian chronicler preserves what might be a quote from Zenobia. Might be invention. Impossible to verify, but it sounds right. In my time, I was one of the most powerful women in the East. Now I am an ornament in a Roman garden, useful only as proof that resistance ends in decoration. You've just witnessed a truth history tried to bury, not by destroying evidence, but by calling it mercy. If that matters to you, subscribe to Hidden History. Don't let it stay buried. Zenobia died sometime around 274 CE. We don't know where. We don't know if anyone mourned. That's not an accident. That's the point.